Marie-Louise von Franz was a Swiss psychologist who closely collaborated with Carl Jung from 1933 until his death in 1961. One of von Franz's primary topics of interest was fairy tales. For, like myths, fairy tales contains timeless wisdom that teaches us about the human condition. Jung believed that so much wisdom was contained in the fairy tale that he once told von Franz that, when you study fairy tales you can study the anatomy of man.
Marie-Louise von Franz.
Shadow and evil in fairy tales. After years of interpreting fairy tales from cultures spanning the globe and throughout all periods of history, von Franz came to an important
conclusion concerning the lessons they teach.
No matter the message contained in a fairy tale, you can almost always find a contradicting message in another fairy tale. Von Franz called this the
rule of contradiction.
Or as she explains, I can tell you stories which say that if you meet evil you must fight it, but there are just as many which say that you must run away and not try to fight it. Some say to suffer without hitting back, others say don't be a fool, hit back. There are stories which say that if you are confronted with evil, the only thing to do is lie your way out of it. Others say no, be honest, even towards the devil, and don't become involved with lying. For all these I could give you examples, but it is always a yes and a no. There are just as many stories which say the one as the other.
Marie-Louise von Franz.
Shadow and evil in fairy tales. Upon discovering the rule of contradiction, von Franz was disappointed as she hoped to find lessons that were timeless and indisputable. But after further reflection she came to realize that the rule of contradiction makes sense. The challenges and predicaments of life are countless. There is no one path that is right for everyone. And when faced with an ethical dilemma, it is in choosing between contradictory ways of dealing with it that we become an individual. Or as von Franz explains, if collective material, found in fairy tales, is completely contradictory, if our basic ethical disposition is completely contradictory, only then is it possible for us to have an individual, responsible, free conscious superstructure over the basic opposites. Then we can say that in human nature it would be right to do this or that, but I am going to do this. The third thing, which is my individuality. There would be no individuality if the basic material were not contradictory. That was my comfort after having discovered the terrible truth of
the contradictory structure. Marie-Louise von Franz.
Shadow and evil in fairy tales. There is, however, one exception to the rule of contradiction, one lesson that no fairy tale ever went against, and as von Franz tells us, this exception is that one must never hurt the helpful animal in fairy tales.
Marie-Louise
von Franz, shadow and evil in fairy tales. In this video we look at what this rule means. In practical terms, why Jung believed it is so important to live in accordance with this rule, and how most people break it and suffer as a result. According to von Franz, unpacking the meaning of this rule is simple. The helpful animal in a fairy tale represents the intuitive inner voice that helps us distinguish between right and wrong, good and evil, and which pushes us towards certain paths in life and away from others. Obedience to one's most basic inner being, one's instinctual inner being, is the one thing which is more essential than anything else. In all nations and all fairy tale material, I have never found a different statement.
Marie-Louise von Franz.
Shadow and evil in fairy tales. The helpful animal in fairy tales, in other words, represents man's conscience, and as Jung writes, the etymology of the word conscience tells us that it is a special form of knowledge or consciousness. The peculiarity of conscience is that it is a knowledge of, or certainty about, the emotional value of the ideas we have concerning the motives of our actions. Carl Jung, a psychological view of conscience when faced with a moral dilemma, or significant life decision. Our conscience often manifests as strong emotions and gut feelings impelling us toward certain actions and away from others. Sometimes these emotions will be of a negative sort, warning us not to do something. At other times they will be positive and encourage us to take a certain action. In his essay, A Psychological View of Conscience, Jung notes that many cultures consider conscience to be an expression of God's will, which reveals the power of this human faculty. Obeying one's conscience is easy so long as its commands align with the ethical code of our society and the expectations of one's family and peer group. But sometimes our conscience conflicts with these things, creating a dilemma. Do we obey our conscience, or do we conform to the moral code of our society and the expectations of our social group? Or as Jung writes, conscience, no matter on what it is based, commands the individual to obey his inner voice even at the risk of going astray. We can refuse to obey this command by an appeal to the moral code and the moral views on which it is founded, though with an uncomfortable feeling of having been disloyal. Carl Jung, A Psychological View of Conscience. Most people have an innate terror of going against the social grain, and when faced with the dilemma of obeying their conscience or conforming, they take the latter path.
But when within I the call for conscience we are
Often left with a nagging feeling that we are living a lie, or as Jung explains, the observance of customs and laws can very easily be a cloak for a lie so subtle that our fellow human beings are unable to detect it. It may help us to escape all criticism.
Moral del M. We slow
down and not rush into action. Compulsive urges and a desire to act in haste are a sign that we are being guided by our